frozen expanse of the Russian Far East lies a haunting tale of forgotten voices, of entire communities displaced, cultures erased, and lives shattered under the weight of colonization and oppression. From the brutal extraction of resources to the unforgiving labor camps of the Soviet era, indigenous peoples were stripped of their lands, their languages, and their identities. Generations lost their traditions to boarding schools that silenced native tongues, while sacred lands were scarred by industrial greed. But this is not just a story of suffering. It is one of resilience, where against all odds, these communities fight to reclaim their heritage and protect the lands that have always been their lifeblood. What remains of their legacy, and what does their struggle mean for the future of this forgotten frontier? Stay with us as we uncover the untold history of the indigenous peoples of the Russian Far East. The treatment of native peoples in the Russian Far East: exploitation, displacement, forced labor, and cultural erasure. The Russian Far East, a vast and resource-rich region, has been home to numerous indigenous communities for thousands of years. These groups, including the Chukchi, Evenki, Koryaks, Itelmens, Nivk, Nanai, and many others, have maintained distinct languages, cultures, and livelihoods despite the harsh environmental conditions. However, the expansion of the Russian Empire, followed by Soviet policies, profoundly disrupted their lives. The history of these peoples is marked by exploitation, displacement, forced labor, and cultural erasure, all of which have left lasting scars on their communities. This essay explores these themes in greater depth, examining the historical, political, and cultural dimensions of their experiences. 1. Historical context and colonial expansion. Her initial contact and Russian conquest. The first interactions between Russians and indigenous peoples in the Far East occurred during the 17th century as Cossack explorers pushed eastward in search of furs and other resources. Indigenous groups were largely unfamiliar with the centralized power structures of the Russian state and were ill-equipped to resist its military and economic might. The Russian state quickly imposed the yasak system, a tribute tax that required indigenous peoples to pay in furs. This system was deeply exploitative, as it forced indigenous hunters to prioritize overhunting for the state rather than sustaining their traditional economies. Those who resisted were often met with violence. Entire communities were massacred or displaced. For example, the Yukagirs, once a populous group, were reduced to a small remnant population due to the combined effects of violence, disease, and exploitation. The role of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church played a significant role in colonizing the Far East. Missionaries sought to convert indigenous peoples, often through coercion. Conversion to Christianity was frequently tied to the adoption of Russian customs, further eroding indigenous traditions. For instance, many traditional spiritual practices were labeled as pagan and suppressed. Over time, this religious assimilation contributed to the cultural homogenization of the region. The gold rush and industrial exploitation. The discovery of gold in the 19th century brought waves of settlers and prospectors to the Far East, particularly to regions like Kolyma and Amur. Indigenous peoples were often forced to work in dangerous conditions in mines or displaced from their lands to make way for mining operations. This exploitation disrupted their traditional subsistence economies and subjected them to new forms of economic dependency. 2. Forced labor and economic the Gulag system. Under Stalin's regime, the Soviet Union established an extensive network of forced labor camps, or gulags, in the Russian Far East. These camps were integral to the Soviet industrial economy, particularly in resource-rich regions like Magadan and Kolyma, which were known for their gold deposits. Indigenous peoples, along with political prisoners and common criminals, were sent to these camps to perform grueling labor in extreme conditions. The mortality rates in these camps were extraordinarily high due to cold weather, inadequate food, and harsh treatment. For indigenous individuals, this system was particularly devastating because it often separated them from their families and communities, further eroding their cultural and social structures. Collectivization and state farms. The Soviet collectivization policies of the 20th century had a profound impact on indigenous communities. Traditional economies based on hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding were forcibly replaced by collective farms, kolkhozy, and state farms. These farms were often poorly managed and failed to account for local ecological conditions or indigenous knowledge systems. For nomadic groups like the Evenki and Chukchi, collectivization was particularly disruptive. Reindeer herding, a cornerstone of their culture and economy, was reorganized into state-controlled enterprises, stripping herders of their autonomy. Many indigenous people were forced into sedentary lifestyles, which further eroded their traditional ways of life. 3. Cultural erasure and assimilation policies. Education and language suppression. Education policies under both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were specifically designed to assimilate indigenous peoples into Russian culture, often at the expense of their unique identities. Indigenous children were systematically removed from their families and communities and sent to boarding schools or state-run educational institutions, where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their cultural traditions, or adhere to their spiritual beliefs. These policies were justified by the state under the pretense of civilizing the indigenous population and integrating them into the broader Soviet society. The loss of language is one of the most enduring and tragic legacies of these assimilation policies. Indigenous languages, which served as vehicles for passing down oral histories, spiritual beliefs, and ecological knowledge, were systematically marginalized. Languages such as Itelmen, Uday, and Nivk are now critically endangered, with only a handful of speakers remaining, often confined to the older generations. This loss of language is far more than a linguistic issue. It represents the erosion of an entire worldview, including cultural knowledge, indigenous epistemologies, and traditional ways of interacting with the natural environment. Moreover, the forced imposition of Russian as the dominant language in education and governance created significant barriers for indigenous peoples, many of whom found themselves alienated in a society that devalued their heritage. The lack of bilingual education and the suppression of native tongues effectively severed younger generations from their cultural roots, contributing to an ongoing identity crisis within many indigenous communities. Stereotyping and marginalization. Indigenous peoples in the Russian Far East were frequently stereotyped as primitive, backward, or uncivilized by both the Tsarist and Soviet authorities. These negative portrayals served to justify their marginalization and exclusion from political and economic decision-making processes. Soviet propaganda often portrayed indigenous communities as needing guidance, protection, and enlightenment from the state, reinforcing paternalistic attitudes that positioned Russians as superior and indigenous peoples as dependents. These stereotypes had far-reaching consequences. Indigenous individuals were rarely allowed to hold leadership positions or influence policies that directly affected their communities. The systemic discrimination they faced also limited their access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, creating a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement that persists to this day. Suppression of religious practices. Traditional spiritual practices and belief systems were systematically suppressed under both the Tsarist and Soviet regimes. During the era of Russian colonization, the Russian Orthodox Church worked to convert indigenous populations, often by coercive means. Sacred sites were desecrated, and shamans, who were central figures in many indigenous cultures, were often persecuted as heretics or charlatans. Under the Soviet Union, the suppression of religious practices became even more aggressive. The Soviet government's policy of state atheism targeted all forms of religious expression, but indigenous religions faced particularly harsh treatment due to their association with backwardness. Shamans were often imprisoned or executed, and indigenous ceremonies were banned. The loss of spiritual practices further eroded the cultural identity of indigenous peoples, as these practices were deeply intertwined with their ways of life and connection to the land. Desha 4. Environmental exploitation and modern challenges, industrial development and environmental degradation. The Russian Far East is one of the most resource-rich regions in the world, boasting vast reserves of oil, gas, timber, and minerals. Over the past century, industrial projects in this region have prioritized resource extraction over the well-being of indigenous communities and the preservation of the environment. This has had devastating consequences for indigenous lands and livelihoods. Oil drilling, mining, and logging have polluted rivers, destroyed forests, and disrupted ecosystems that indigenous peoples depend on for subsistence. For example, pipeline construction has often cut through reindeer migration routes, forcing herders to adapt to new and less sustainable patterns. Fish stocks, a critical food source for many communities, have been depleted due to overfishing and water pollution caused by industrial activities. The displacement of indigenous communities to make way for industrial projects has further compounded their struggles. Many families have been forced to abandon their ancestral lands, which are not only crucial for their survival, but also hold deep spiritual and cultural significance. Despite legal frameworks requiring companies to consult with indigenous communities, these consultations are often superficial, and compensation is rarely adequate. Climate change. Climate change poses an additional existential threat to indigenous peoples in the Russian Far East, as it continues to fundamentally alter the landscapes and ecosystems upon which these communities have relied for centuries. Rising temperatures, melting permafrost, and shifting weather patterns are increasingly disrupting traditional practices such as reindeer herding, fishing, and hunting. Activities that are not only essential for food security, but also deeply intertwined with indigenous cultural identities and spiritual beliefs. Reindeer herding, for instance, has become significantly more challenging due to the effects of warming temperatures. Changes in vegetation patterns, such as the reduction of lichen, an essential food source for reindeer, have forced herders to traverse greater distances in search of grazing lands. Additionally, melting permafrost and seasonal instability in snow and ice conditions make it more difficult to predict migration routes and ensure the safety of herds. This disruption not only threatens the livelihoods of indigenous families, but also erodes the cultural practices tied to reindeer herding, such as oral storytelling, ceremonial traditions, and intergenerational knowledge transfer. Fishing and hunting, which have sustained indigenous communities for generations, are also under threat. Key species that have historically been central to indigenous diets and cultural practices are migrating to new regions or experiencing population declines as water temperatures rise and ecosystems shift. Salmon, a cornerstone of subsistence and cultural heritage for many indigenous groups, is particularly vulnerable to these changes, with spawning patterns and habitats increasingly disrupted. The decline of species diversity and availability intensifies food insecurity and forces communities to adapt to unfamiliar and often less sustainable alternatives. Moreover, the impacts of climate change exacerbate existing economic and social vulnerabilities faced by indigenous peoples in the region. Limited access to resources, inadequate infrastructure, and marginalization from political decision-making processes make it even more difficult for these communities to mitigate or adapt to the challenges posed by climate change. This confluence of factors leaves indigenous populations increasingly vulnerable, both environmentally and socioeconomically, and underscores the urgent need for tailored policies and climate resilience strategies that address their unique challenges. 5. Modern-day resilience and revitalization. Legal protections and advocacy. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's dissolution, there have been some attempts to recognize and protect the rights of indigenous peoples in the Russian Far East. The Russian Constitution formally guarantees the rights of indigenous minorities to preserve their cultural heritage, maintain their traditional ways of life, and use their ancestral lands. However, the practical implementation of these protections has been inconsistent, with weak enforcement mechanisms often failing to hold corporations or state agencies accountable for violations. Conflicts between industrial development and indigenous land rights remain a significant issue. Despite legal frameworks requiring consultation with indigenous communities, such consultations are often symbolic and fail to incorporate meaningful input. Compensation for land loss or environmental degradation is typically inadequate, leaving indigenous groups to bear the brunt of these disruptions without sufficient support. Indigenous activists and organizations, such as the Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Siberia, and the Far East, have emerged as powerful advocates for their communities. These organizations document human rights violations, promote the enforcement of existing legal protections, and work to raise awareness about the ongoing challenges faced by indigenous peoples. Their efforts have brought indigenous voices to national and international forums, where they advocate for stronger protections, increased accountability, and more equitable resource-sharing arrangements. Cultural revitalization. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to revitalize indigenous cultures and ensure that their rich heritage is preserved for future generations. Festivals celebrating indigenous traditions, such as dance, music, and storytelling, have become important platforms for showcasing cultural pride and fostering community unity. These events also serve as opportunities for indigenous peoples to educate others about their histories, values, and ways of life. Language preservation is a central focus of cultural revitalization efforts. Many indigenous languages, which are critically endangered due to historical assimilation policies, are now the subject of educational programs aimed at younger generations. Community-run language schools, online learning platforms, and the documentation of oral histories are playing crucial roles in this revival. Linguistic preservation is not only about communication, but also about safeguarding the cultural knowledge, spiritual beliefs, and ecological wisdom embedded in these languages. Cultural centers and museums dedicated to indigenous heritage have also been established, providing spaces for education, dialogue, and the preservation of traditional crafts, music, and ceremonial practices. Indigenous leaders and scholars are actively working to document and archive oral histories, ensuring that these valuable cultural resources are not lost to time. These efforts are particularly important in fostering a sense of identity and continuity among younger members of indigenous communities, who are often caught between modernity and tradition. Environmental stewardship. Indigenous peoples are increasingly emerging as leaders in environmental stewardship, advocating for sustainable development practices that respect their ancestral lands and the ecosystems they depend upon. Their traditional ecological knowledge, passed down through generations of living harmoniously with nature, is invaluable for understanding sustainable resource management and adapting to the challenges posed by climate change. This knowledge includes detailed understandings of local flora and fauna, seasonal patterns and ecological relationships, which allow indigenous communities to propose sustainable solutions to environmental challenges. Indigenous groups have been actively collaborating with environmental organizations to monitor and address the adverse effects of industrial projects. These partnerships often focus on documenting environmental degradation, raising awareness about unsustainable practices, and promoting conservation-first approaches. For example, indigenous leaders have worked with conservationists to protect critical habitats and advocate for the responsible use of natural resources. Legal challenges have also been a key tool in their efforts to resist industrial developments that threaten their lands and livelihoods. In some cases, these legal battles have resulted in significant victories, such as halting environmentally destructive projects or securing reparations for damages caused by industrial activities. In the context of climate change, the role of indigenous peoples in environmental advocacy has taken on even greater importance. Their deep-rooted understanding of local ecosystems and their cultural commitment to stewardship make them indispensable partners in global efforts to promote biodiversity, combat deforestation, and address climate-related risks. Indigenous communities, for example, have implemented practices like rotational hunting and fishing, controlled burning to maintain biodiversity, and conservation of sacred natural sites. Incorporating indigenous perspectives into broader environmental policies provides an opportunity to develop more holistic and effective approaches to sustainability. These efforts not only benefit indigenous communities, but also contribute to the global fight against ecological degradation and climate change, underscoring the importance of their leadership in shaping a sustainable future. Conclusion. The treatment of indigenous peoples in the Russian Far East is a story marked by exploitation, displacement, and resilience. From the early days of Russian colonization through the industrialization policies of the Soviet Union to the present-day challenges of globalization and climate change, indigenous communities have faced immense hardships. The dispossession of ancestral lands, the suppression of cultural identities, and the destruction of ecosystems have left lasting scars on their ways of life. Despite these challenges, the resilience of indigenous peoples has remained unwavering. Through sustained advocacy, cultural revitalization, and environmental stewardship, these communities are reclaiming their rights, preserving their heritage, and protecting their lands for future generations. Their efforts to resist exploitation and adapt to modern challenges highlight their strength, determination, and the richness of their cultural and ecological knowledge. To address the historical and ongoing injustices faced by indigenous peoples, a multifaceted and enduring approach is required. This includes strengthening legal protections, ensuring meaningful consultation and representation in policy-making processes, and investing in the preservation of cultural and linguistic heritage. Governments and international organizations must also acknowledge and integrate indigenous knowledge into global conservation strategies, as it holds critical insights into sustainability and environmental resilience. The contributions of indigenous communities to cultural diversity and ecological stewardship are invaluable, not just for the Russian Far East, but for humanity as a whole. By supporting these communities and ensuring their voices are heard, there is hope for a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable future. The story of the indigenous peoples of the Russian Far East is not only one of suffering, but also one of strength, survival, and the enduring hope for justice and recognition.